So this video focuses on the order of sewing for particularly a blouse or a shirt or a top, something that's on the top half of the body. So what you want to do is start by sewing. This now is after you've done all of your marking and preparing for sewing. As you can see with these pieces, they've been snipped, they've been tailor tacked, everything is ready. Okay, so I have a this is a sample, so it's a tiny mini little bodice front, bodice back, and there is a sleeve there. They've all been snipped, they've all been tailor tacked, and if it was the real garment, you would also have overlocked all the bits that you would need overlocked in advance. But just to talk through the order of garments in general, in terms of blouses and shirts, what you would do is first sew anything that would be on your, the front, say, of the garment or the back. So if there was any darts, if there was any type of feature, like a panel line, like gathers, like a pocket, anything at all, if there was, say, embroidery that you were doing on the front of the garment, you'd want to do that now while the garment was flat. Okay, so if I separate these, so I need to snip the tailor tacks so I can have my two front pieces there lined up. Okay, so you can see the way while the garment is flat, it's much easier to get in and do any type of detailed work on these pieces. So that would be the first thing you do, or if you have panel lines, darts or whatever. So essentially there's things that are easier to sew while they're flat before you go into 3 dimensions. Your darts are going to start making the garment into 3 dimensions, and then sewing it to, say, sewing the front to the back starts to make it more 3-dimensional. So it's the same for the sleeve. If there was some embroidery you wanted to do here, if there was a pocket, if there was anything at all that you want to do on the sleeve, do all those features first. So some things, depending on the style and design of the garment, sometimes you're actually doing quite a lot of work before you've even sewn up any seam at all. So that's the first thing. The next thing then, once you've sewn up all the features, say, on the front of the garment, all your panels are together, your darts, everything, you then sew together the garment at the side seam and the shoulder. So in this case, the garment, let's see, it's only a tiny little example. So I'm going to separate that, little dart. So I'm going to imagine that I have sewn these darts here, and then I would place this together. So the side seams there, they're only tiny, and the shoulders. Okay, so when you place them together, it's now forming 3 dimensions. So a common misunderstanding is that when you lie the back on top of the front, that they should somehow line up exactly. But just remember, the front of the body is different to the back of the body, and they shouldn't, when the patterns are laid flat, they shouldn't match exactly. Okay, so you take the back and you just place it with the little the side seam in this case, and it would be ready to stitch down there. And the same with the shoulder. Now on the shoulder seams, they are very much at an angle. So when you're lining up the shoulder, this is where your snips really come into play. Okay, so if you line up your 2 snips there for the 1.5, and you know that that's where how you line them up, and you ignore the angles that happen inside of the seam allowance. Okay, and it would be the same on the other side, you'd be lining those up. Okay, so you'd sew across the shoulder and the side seam, and you would get something that looks like this. Okay, so then what you'd have is kind of like a little, well, this is so small, but something that would go over a mannequin, a little kind of bodice. All right, so then you'd have to think about your garment and decide which thing is next. Generally speaking, I often move on to the collar, because the collar is often a small piece, and before I put on sleeves onto this, and if the sleeves are big, they'll be getting in the way while I'm trying to sew the collar. So often I move on to the collar as the next thing. However, if you're moving on to the collar, you actually have to move on to facings, because you have to put the facings on so that you can insert the collar. Okay, so if you are moving on to the collar as your next step, then you actually need to move on to the facings. So you might have little facings looking something like that. Okay, it can be a little bit confusing as to how to sew these together and how to match them. If you come from this direction, you might be able to see, okay, that looks correct. But then to sew them, of course, you have to put them right side to right side. So they need to go like this and like that. Okay, and again, following your snips, you should line up the notches, the snips where you're about to sew there. And that's how you know that they line up. Oopsie. Okay, so once you have sewn the facing together, you have something that looks like that. That's what it looks like when it's sewn together. Okay, and then the next step is, like I have completed here, you stitch it up along the center front, or could be the center back, or wherever. But for this example, it's along the center front, so I'm stitching up the facing along here, and even in just a little bit here, so I pivot and to the end of the button allowance, okay, because the collar in this case is going to come here, and there'll be this little extra bit for the button allowance. So you do all this before you insert the collar. So I've stitched it up. I've also done an understitch, so that's the little stitch there, that's along the line. This understitch holds the facing from peeping out, so it holds it back. Okay, you'll be able to see a different video to see how to do that. Okay, so I've done my understitching there, and then I would do the same on the other side. I would have to place this here. It would need to sew here, so I'd need to place it right side to right side, stitch up along that, and when I get to that stage, I would be ready to have my oval shape there for my collar, and I would insert my collar. So in terms of the collar, you would have the collar, which we have here with the pattern piece on it. You'd need to snip all your notches, and there would be two collars, so you'd open two of them. You'd need to fuse this collar and the other one with the correct appropriate fusing, and then you would need to sew them together. Okay, so you would sew them together, and again there's a detailed video on how to sew the collar, but this collar has been sewn together, snipped, released, pinched out, and we have our collar here, and so that would be ready to place inside here, inside this oval shape, and we would sew it this way around, placing it right side to right side, pinning it all along and stitching it. And again, there's a proper video of how to apply a collar separately. So this is just giving you the order. Okay, so we've sewn up our front, we've sewn up our features, then we've decided to move on to the collar, and we have sewn our facing. Then we have to physically sew the collar itself up, and then it can be applied to the neckline. Okay, so once we've got our collar all attached to the neckline, we might move on to the sleeves. So the sleeves then start out like this, and again there's a detailed video on the how to sew up the sleeves and insert them into the armhole, so see that, but this is again just an overview. So you would sew the sleeve first, so you have your two sleeves, you'd have to make two opposite sleeves, so fold this one that way and the one behind the other way, stitch them together, and you would get what looks like this, two opposite sleeves. Then you would find the appropriate sleeve that this would go onto, sorry, the appropriate armhole. So whether this is so this is our single and this is our double, so this would go to the front, so that would match that way, so that would be this sleeve. And again, see the detailed demonstration of of how to insert the sleeve. So then you would insert the sleeve. Now, actually, just before you put the sleeve on, if there was any cuff or anything else that you needed to put onto the sleeve, you would do that first before you add it on to the garment. Again, you're just thinking of, like if you're trying to work on a cuff here, that there isn't a whole garment attached to it, so it's handier. So after you've done the collar and the sleeve, so you're pretty much finishing your garment then. So if all of your features are on, you're down to your finishings, which would be your fastenings, whether that's a zip or buttons or whatever other type of fastening, and your hem. So you need to look at these together. Sometimes the hem needs to be done first, depending on the type of zip or the type of button fastening or whichever. So, but you would be doing those two toward the end. And again, you can see a detailed button and buttonhole kind of video demonstration for how to put the buttons on, and as well as that, which type of hem. So you'd have determined whether you're doing a machine hem or a blind hand done hem, but that would be the finishing. Just remember as well that you would need to press at every single stage. So your very first stage where you sew your shoulder and side seams together, you need to press those seams at that stage. Then when you sew the facing together, you can see they've been pressed open before I start to attach it to here, and then once this has been sewn, you press it open first, then do my understitching. So each time you stitch something, you press it. Okay, and then you shouldn't have too much work at the end for a final press. It should be just a once kind of a last kind of go over with the yarn. Okay, so just a little review in terms of the order of sewing a shirt or blouse. You would start with sewing features or darts or panels or embroideries or pockets or anything at all onto the front of your garment. Likewise on the back, so all of the back, so it's one whole piece. Then you'll sew the two together. So along the shoulders and side seams, you would sew them together. And then you would generally move on to the collar. So for the collar, you first need to apply the facing. So you need to be sure the facings are fused, sewn together, and applied to the center, front, or back. Then you also would need the collar to be sewn together and turned the right way out before you can apply the collar to the neckline. So one side of the collar gets sewn to the garment, the other side gets sewn to the facing. Then you might move on to the sleeves, do anything on the sleeve at all that needs to be done before, cuffs or whatever feature onto the sleeve, and then insert it into the armhole. After you've got all your features on and any collars or sleeves, you'd be down to the finishings, which would be your fastenings and your hems. So hopefully that's a reasonable overview of the order of doing a garment, particularly a shirt or blouse. Obviously would really depend on the style, the design that you've chosen. There could be quite a few exceptions to that. And also just remember that this is a guideline. If for some reason you don't have your fabric for your collar, you go ahead and work on the sleeves or whatever other part first. So, for various other reasons, you may need to sew up the garment in a different order. So this has just outlined the optimal order on a kind of standard garment, shirt or blouse.